Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Evan and Brandy, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today at CanREA's Spring Forward event. I'd also like to thank CanREA's board chair, Michelle Chislett, for her remarks, and Peter Fraser from the International Energy Agency for his very interesting keynote address. Bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Merci de votre participation à l'événement printanier de CanREA. Je tiens à remercier notre président du conseil d'administration, Michelle Chislett, pour son discours et à reconnaître Peter Fraser de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie pour une allocution très intéressante. The title of this event is Spring Forward, and in my remarks today, I want to focus on why that's the title. Simply put, we call it Spring Forward because that's exactly what Canada needs to do right now. We need to start dramatically scaling up the deployment of wind energy, solar energy, and energy storage in Canada if we're to succeed in beating the climate crisis. We need to spring into action right now. Just last week, we saw the federal government announce new targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 45% from 2005 levels by 2030. It's also introduced legislation to implement its commitment to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Now, targets are one thing, but action is another. With its fall economic statement, the Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy Climate Plan, and the recent budget, the federal government has now outlined a series of proposed measures that offer some real potential to provide a solid foundation to build upon to help us achieve these targets. But if we're to meet Canada's 2030 target and to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, we need to move now past these proposals and we need to move forward with implementation. We've got no time to waste. We need to take a major spring forward. Now, meeting these targets will be a significant challenge. Canada has only reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 1.1% in the last 14 years. Our new target requires us to reduce emissions by a minimum of 40% in the next 9 years. It sounds daunting, but it's not impossible. And clean, renewable electricity is actually the key. The wind, solar, and energy storage industries have already demonstrated the capacity to scale up quickly, as shown by the transformation of our technologies over the last 2 decades. Indeed, I've been fortunate to be involved in these industries since 2003. And I clearly remember at that time, we had a little over 300 megawatts of wind, negligible amounts of solar energy, and really no non-hydro energy storage in Canada. Our technologies at that time were considered marginal, niche. They were even labeled in newspapers as toy power. And for organizations like the International Energy Agency, wind and solar at that time were still little more than research projects. Now things have changed enormously since then, in Canada and around the world. Over the last decade, wind and solar energy have been the largest source of new electricity generating capacity in Canada. It's been driven by dramatic cost reductions, 90% in solar, 70% in wind, 90% in battery energy storage. Our technologies are now the lowest cost sources of new electricity generation in the country. And as Mr. Fraser said in his remarks, it's this evolution that's occurred with our technologies that has opened up the conversation about net zero and allowed us to seriously consider the path forward to get there. Indeed, his speech was remarkable in the fact that it highlighted a number of statements that we would never have heard from the International Energy Agency 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. Renewable energy will be the core of the energy transition. Energy has traditionally meant oil, but by 2050, energy will mean renewable energy. It shows the progress that we've made. Our technologies are going to be the key enabler of the transition to net zero. Mr. Fraser noted that the first priority on the path to net zero is to decarbonize the electricity grid, and then to expand and use that electricity to reduce the use of fossil fuels in transportation and buildings and industry through electrification, and through the production of green hydrogen that can help us to decarbonize more difficult sectors like long-distance transportation or heavy industry. These comments that we heard from the IEA are consistent with every single study that has envisioned a net zero pathway for Canada. So the path we need to take is actually quite clear, but it won't just happen. We will need a mix of market signals, regulatory requirements, infrastructure investments, and regulatory and market reforms to accelerate the deployment of our technologies to enable us to get to net zero. And that work needs to start now. Let's talk first about decarbonizing the electricity grid. I mentioned earlier that Canada has only reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 1% since 2005. But although that overall number seems bleak, greenhouse gas emissions in the electricity sector have fallen by 46% in that period. We now have an electricity grid that's 82% non-emitting, and that's a tremendous start. But if we're to succeed, we need to fully decarbonize our electricity grid, and we need to do that well before 2050 if we want to achieve net zero by that date. And that's why CanREA is calling upon Canada to match the United States and work to decarbonize the electricity grid by 2035. We believe the federal government could use a clean electricity standard to get there, and we'll be advocating for this, much in the same way that regulations have played a critical role in supporting the phase-out of coal-fired generation in Canada. Carbon pricing is also going to be critical. While the federal commitment to increase Canada's carbon price to $170 a tonne by 2030 has certainly discouraged the building of new natural gas-fired generation, existing natural gas-fired generation continues to be almost fully sheltered from the carbon price. And there's little incentive to decrease its use or substitute non-emitting alternatives. This must be addressed as a priority. All electricity generation needs to move towards full exposure to the carbon price, whether under the federal carbon backstop or under the various provincial systems that serve as alternatives across the country. Full decarbonization of the electricity grid is achievable and must be a priority. There's almost no country as well positioned as Canada to get there. Second, we have to dramatically increase the supply of decarbonized electricity to meet the increased demand that we're going to see through electrification and the use of green hydrogen. Now, Canada is fortunate. It has abundant, untapped, low-cost renewable energy resources, and we're extremely well positioned to pursue the doubling of decarbonized electricity production that's likely going to be required to get us to net zero. But we shouldn't underestimate the size of the challenge. Between 2005 and 2018, Canada's electricity production increased by 7%. Meeting our net zero target will likely require us to increase our electricity production by 100% in the next 30 years. Now, this new supply isn't going to be built in the absence of new demand. And that's why CanREA is calling on Canada to develop and implement comprehensive strategies to enable electrification and the use of green hydrogen, because that's what will provide a clear signal to investors that increased decarbonized electricity production is going to be required. Those signals are required sooner rather than later, because it's going to take time to develop, to permit, to construct these new facilities that will be absolutely critical to us achieving our goals. We can already see an example of how this is going to work in the province of Quebec. Quebec has Canada's most advanced electrification strategy and is now committed to a multi-year procurement of the new renewable energy resources that are going to be required to support that increased demand. We need both federal and provincial governments across the country to follow suit. We're also going to need to encourage and facilitate investment in enabling infrastructure, broadly defined. And that's because the future grid must not only be decarbonized, it must also remain reliable. While Peter Fraser noted that the biggest surprise to date with increased renewable energy production has been the fact that there's been relatively few problems with integration, he also noted, and we're well aware, that the future is going to bring bigger challenges. But we also know that we have the technical solutions to address them. Part of the answer is to invest in new transmission, because as Mr. Fraser said, and as numerous studies have demonstrated, Canada has to become more interconnected. It has to take advantage of its abundant hydroelectric resources if we're to reach net zero at the lowest possible cost. But it's not all about transmission. We need investments in smart grid and AI infrastructure, coupled with reforms of electricity, market and regulatory frameworks to enable wind and solar energy to provide ancillary services to the grid, and to enable energy storage projects to become full grid participants that can do the same. We also need to remove barriers to the accelerated deployment of distributed energy resources, like behind-the-meter solar. This will make our grid more distributed, yes, but also more diverse and more resilient. And a good start would be to strengthen our net metering frameworks across the country, to enable virtual net metering or third-party ownership of net metering. There's clearly going to be a lot to do to successfully transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. It can be intimidating, but we have no choice. Climate change is an existential threat. It's the greatest challenge our generation is going to face. And if we want to leave our children and grandchildren a world in which they not only survive, but a world in which they thrive going forward, we need to step up and we need to take a great spring forward. CanREA is up for the challenge, but we're going to need your help to succeed. Thank you for being here, for taking time to join us for these next 2 days of discussions. I hope it helps to galvanize our thinking as individuals and as an industry on how we can best face the challenges ahead and the opportunities, because this represents a tremendous opportunity for our industry. Thank you very much for your attention. Merci beaucoup de votre attention.